I'm just going to go ahead and pour this last little bit. And then I'm going to move on to the large roller, because that's what most people are going to use on their sun decks. You know, it's almost overkill on a project like this, but I want to show you what it's like. It's not quite the same as either one of these rollers here. And sorry, I'm not sure if I said this, but one of the downsides with these rollers are you have to keep them well maintained, and that means when you're not using it, you have to put it in acetone just to keep it clean. Otherwise, those segments, those gaps basically, will get filled up with resin that's hardening, and it's not an insurmountable problem. You can burn it out with a torch, but it's kind of a big pain, and if you get it really gummed up, you know, it's a fairly expensive tool that just gets thrown in the garbage, whereas little rollers like this are really meant to be disposable afterwards. Okay, I'm not having quite enough resin here, I don't think, to finish off, so I'm going to quickly mix up another batch. Okay, I'm going to start just making up the next batch. This one's a little bit bigger because I knew, calculated kind of how much I figured I would need for the rest of this project. So I'm just going to mix in the catalyst, and because it's a bigger batch, I'm going to definitely take my time stirring this in. You can't see it because it's a white pail here, but just want to make sure that I get it everywhere. Smaller batches, really, you can go quite quickly when you mix, but bigger batches, you want to take your time. Now, the one thing about fiberglass resin and the catalyst, beyond the relationship to temperature, you also have to worry about how big of a batch you make. And it all comes down to heat again. Basically, when you make a larger batch, and it's sitting in the bucket and it's generating heat, it kind of builds on itself. You're basically created a big lump of heat, and so that lump in your bucket, your liquid resin at the time, is going to set up quicker than if it's spread out on the sun deck. So especially if you think you've mixed it hot, sometimes you're better off, unless it's a really sunny day and your sun deck's really hot, you're sometimes better off spreading it out thin, and that just gives you more time to work with it. Because if you leave it in the bucket using it as you need it, then it's going to cure quicker because it's in this big lump heating up. So I'm satisfied now that I've got it mixed. I'm just going to finish a few spots that looked a little bit dry on the back here. Okay, now I can move to the front portion of the deck, and like I said, I'm going to get rid of this small roller and move to the large roller. So I'll get the segmented roller out for the moment just so I have room, and the catalyst, I don't need that anymore. So now I'm going to pour out a larger section here. You have to be a little careful when you pour this out, because where you pour it out, it tends to break down the binders of the fabric more quickly than it does elsewhere. And if you're not careful, you can end up kind of spreading the fibers of those areas that have lost their binder properties quicker. You can kind of end up spreading them around. It ends up a bit like a fiber jelly. So I'm just trying to get it fairly even in this section as far as my resin distribution goes, and then I'll worry about getting the actual air bubbles out afterwards. And when I'm doing a real sun deck, this is exactly how I do it. I just pour it on, roll a bit, pour it on, roll a bit. It's always nice to have somebody mixing these up to go with you as you go along, so you don't have to stop every time you need a new bucket and mix it up. Like I said, that makes it a lot easier to keep a wet edge, and that's what you want to do. So now I'm just working out the air bubbles in this section. Anything that looks a little white, just put a little bit more resin. It looks a little dry at this point. And I'm going right to the edge here, if not a little bit over the edge. I don't need to get all these fibers off the edge wet, because they're just going to get cut off anyways. But what I do want to do is have a little bit of resin off the edge, because that's going to allow me to trim it a lot easier. Trimming fiberglass when it's green, as they say, when it's just not quite cured, but not soft or liquid either, is much easier than trying to cut off a dry fiber that's attached to hardened resin. So I'm just going to finish off this corner here. And this is going nice and smoothly. And that's partly because we've taken our time up to this point. And there's no surprises. There's no measuring of the mat. There's no spots underneath that are uneven and not filled in. And that all can make for air bubbles, and air bubbles are what we're trying to avoid at this point. I mean, the nice thing about fiberglass decks is even the mistakes are not the end of the world. In another part of this video, as a add-on, I'll show how you fix the problems that could come up if it doesn't go smoothly the first time around. But obviously this is what you're aiming for. You're aiming for just a nice smooth deck. If you're looking along the edge, you'd see all the fiber. And that's nice because it gives you a little bit of pattern, gives you a little bit of texture, so it's not as slippery when you're all finished and when you put on the gel coat. And it's just even and it's smooth, and there's no air bubbles underneath. We just double check along the edge here is what I'll do right now. And at this point I'm done. I'm just going to let this dry. The next step is basically do a little bit of sanding, because even though it seems like it's all laying nice and flat, what I might have is a few little hairs sticking up that the roller is pulled up as I'm rolling along. And we don't want those because those will be sharp when we're walking on it with bare feet or whatnot. So we'll sand those off. We'll sand off these edges, or cut them off and then sand them as it may be. And then what we'll do is we'll put the gel coat, mix it up, it's just another version of resin, and we'll paint that on.